Welcome to LCRL's Liberty Alert in Washington, D.C. with your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz. Talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now, your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. Welcome to our Liberty Alert. And today we're going to be talking about some of the things that are happening in D.C. that could affect you. But remember what we do here. We're an advocate for the church, and we're always trying to prepare you to live two kingdom citizen lives for the sake of the gospel, no matter what's going on in the culture. But there are times that the culture impinges or begins to push back on the church's ability to do that. And we need to let you know about that, tell you how you can deal with those kinds of things. And unfortunately, there are a lot of those things happening in Washington, D.C. right now, especially with the Biden-Harris administration. And, you know, I've got a special guest with us again today, Tim Goeglein, who's got his ear on the ground. He's with Focus on the Family, but he has been a very good friend of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty. Tim, welcome to the program today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be asked to be on.
Well, it's great to be with you as always. And you said you were dealing with some ice in Washington, D.C., but it's the water kind.
It is. It has been a remarkably cold East Coast winter. And it has been particularly a challenge with the ice. Ice has really blanketed Washington, D.C. over and over and over again, which I suppose is a metaphor for the slippery nature, right? Of the swamp.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, how when he said it's ice, you know, there's ice everywhere. And I kept thinking, my mind was already taken to a political perspective. It just shows how we're immersed in this stuff. And in some ways, we wish it would just go back in its proper place.
Yes.
And maybe that's what we need to talk about today, because this HHS Health and Human Services Director nominee, you know, I'm talking about today as versus the culture of life versus the average folks in the country, and why this really matters. And I think I want to start us off by just saying it this way. You know, we were again told over and over again that the Biden-Harris administration was going to be very, very moderate. It was going to be unifying. It was going to try to bring everybody together in these kinds of things. And then we had 52 executive orders that were some of the most radical things. And an executive order usually is supposed to actually give power and stuff back to the people. These were things that actually gave power back to the government and to a lot of the things that we're thinking, gosh, this should not be done this way. And then now I think with the HHS Director nominee, we really have a salvo that's kind of thrown back into the fray. And it's not a moderate. It's not a sign of a moderate administration. It's a sign of exactly the opposite of that. And so Xavier Becerra, who I think the nomination now is scheduled for next week, is that correct?
Actually, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And it will be one of the most, I would argue, one of the most important domestic hearings yet.
Well, talk about why that is, because our people, you know, I've had people say to me, how come you guys didn't tell us about this? And I said, we've been talking about these things for 6-8 months. We've been writing about them for 2-3 years. And, you know, I guess to some degree, people just didn't believe that these kinds of things were real. Well, with Becerra's nomination, you're talking about empowering someone with federal government strength behind him to do things that he was doing in California that were truly heinous. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I will. And I'd like to begin, if I may, Greg, just by taking one step back for perspective. You know, for people who do not live and work in Washington, D.C., or pay much attention to what goes on here, they may have heard of the Health and Human Services Administration, called HHS, as you said a moment ago.
Right.
But they may not realize how gargantuan and how, in the scale of domestic agencies, what a colossus HHS is. HHS, among all of the domestic policy executive cabinet agencies, is overwhelmingly the largest.
Yeah.
This is the agency, for instance, that oversees Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare. And the nation's Surgeon General is there. I really could go on and on.
And let me jump in there. That's one of the reasons why I used to say you don't want universal health care, because then that agency literally has all the information about your life and
Yes.
can pretty much do, like you saw with the pandemic, they can start to do things to you that you can't actually push back on.
Well, the power that is ceded to HHS is absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
When you look around, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat cabinet room at the White House, and there's the Attorney General, there's the Secretary of Defense, there's the Secretary of State, thought to be the three most important people around that table, next to only the president and the vice president. I would actually add, Greg, into that mix the person who becomes the Secretary of HHS. And I say that in my opening comments to you because I want to give the full weight to just how the sheer amount of power that whoever becomes the Secretary of HHS has.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of starting premise. And to your point, we as a nation are in the most polarized, toxic times, maybe equaled only by the Civil War or the moral and social revolution of the 60s and 70s. I mean, the level of toxicity and faction is enormous. And so the appeal of President Biden's, unity language has been very important to the early narrative of his entire presidency. And yet, coming down the pike is a highly divisive figure in the man whom President Biden has nominated to oversee HHS, the man you mentioned a moment ago, Javier or Xavier Becerra from California. He's a former member of the House of Representatives, a very important state elected official in California. But there is nothing in his background, and I know nothing's a big statement, but there's nothing in his background that would suggest that, he would be nominated to the Department of Health and Human Services. He's not run things. He has not been a font of policy on health. There's quite literally nothing in his background where you would say, well, that would qualify him to be the head of HHS. But there is one narrative. There is one common thread across his time in the House of Representatives, across his time in state government in California. And that common thread is that he is a militant pro-abortionist.
Yes.
And he is equally and justifiably, in his own mind and in the mind of many of his fellow progressives, very uncomfortable with religious liberty and conscience rights. My friend, the editor of National Review, I think wisely said, what kind of a man, bullies nuns, Catholic nuns? And this is a man who in his professional life has bullied nuns. So if you look at Mr. Becerra's record in California, and you look at his record in the House, which I have done extensively, and my colleagues at Focus on the Family have done extensively, you realize that the reason he's been chosen is because of the oceans of pro-abortion money that is flowing and has flowed into the Democratic Party and into this presidency. Pro-abortion money is the mother's milk of politics in contemporary Democratic politics. And by the way, I want to be very fair. There are mother's milk, funding strains that are equally big in the Republican Party. And if we were talking about a Republican presidency, I would work to find, the equivalent in the Republican Party, but in the Democratic Party, abortion is absolutely the non-negotiable if you are to be nominated at HHS, and people who are militantly pro-abortion have found their man in the man that they want to be the secretary of HHS.
Well, and that's where I want to stop and just say to all of our Christian friends, all of those who are, you may not even be Christian, but you have a moral perspective on life. You think you have a traditional moral view about life. This is the stuff that just continually bugs me, because you talked about how Biden's appeal was that he was going to be moderate. I say that was his cover, because the reality is, like you said before, nobody in the modern Democratic Party is going to buck the Planned Parenthood organization, and so it doesn't matter that we find out that they're selling baby parts. It doesn't matter that they're butchering children, that they're actually not taking care. They're not providing health care for women. They're providing abortion. Period. It doesn't matter that we uncover all these things, and then it doesn't even matter that they're actually receiving government money and PPP loans and all this kind of stuff. The pro-life movement isn't that intertwined with government at all, and yet somehow this narrative that this moderate president's going to do moderate things that unify us, but one of the first things he does is he puts one of the most radical pro-abortion activists. He was actually part of the Supreme Court bill that had his name attached to it, where he was trying to sue pro-life organizations in California, right?
Absolutely right. And I think that, even for our friends who perhaps don't share our pro-life,
Right.
prerogatives, and there are plenty of those, even they have shared with me, several of them actually, that they believe that the principal role that he has played does give some of them pause, even for those who share Mr. Becerra's pro-abortion views. I had a discussion on the Hill 2 weeks ago with a friend of mine who works for a very prominent Democratic senator. And I said, in the upcoming hearings, do you believe that Mr. Becerra's activism on the issue of both abortion and in opposition to religious liberty, would that give your member, of the Senate some pause, even though they are in the same party? And she said to me, absolutely, yes. She said, we have looked at the record and we realize that you cannot, and this is, I'm paraphrasing what she said you cannot really understand him apart from his views, on abortion and religious liberty. I mean, that is a remarkable statement.
Well, and I think that goes also to the charge that's leveled against us, and I was going to talk about that later. But they always say that Christians are one issue voters. It's about pro-life, pro-life, pro-life. And the reality is pro-life is an expansive term. It's not just anti-abortion. It talks about all kinds of end-of-life issues. It talks about government involvement in our life issues. Pro-life is a very big perspective, and it's one that we actually believe exists for all people. So we're fighting for the sanctity of life, even for those with whom we disagree.
Yes. Yes.
Here you have an activist, like you said, who if you want to talk about a one vote pony, here's a guy whose whole life is defined by, and he's going after, like you said, the nuns, the little sisters of the poor. He's demanding that pro-life places of service, pro-life clinics, and Yvette served in a pro-life clinic in New York. I was involved with the pro-life clinics. They're usually mom and pop places that are supported by the donations of people. He went after these people. He demanded that they actually talk about abortion to their people, even though it was against their conscience. That was the kind of guy we're talking about here. And again, I guess what I'm trying to get at is why there doesn't seem to be much of an uproar in the press or any of this kind of stuff about how radical this guy is. And if this is supposed to be unifying us, there's obviously got to be a more moderate person in the Democratic cadre of leaders that we could put forward, right?
Yes, I believe that there most certainly are. I think even those of us in Washington who follow HHS policy quite literally every day. I
Yeah.
think back to my second point, if I may, and the one that you raised earlier, Greg, isn't it mystifying to people that there's zero in this man's background that has to do with health
Right.
or medicine?
Right.
I promise I've read as much research and information as I can possibly find, on this man, and there's nothing where you would say, well, it's because of that he taught, in a university.
Hmm.
Or he worked, in a corporation or company or family business, that dealt with health or medical policy, or perhaps was, a former governor, etc. But I want to raise another issue, if I may,
Hmm.
and this is setting aside qualifications for a moment. I'd like to go back to where we began. In our nation's great history, we have only had two Catholic presidents. John F. Kennedy, who was elected in 1960, and Joseph Biden. And one of the things that I think is mostly forgotten, as a Catholic, is how completely in opposition the new president is to his own church.
Right.
For all of the differences, historic differences that Lutherans and Catholics have had and continue to have in the public square on the issue of the sanctity of life and religious liberty and the Imago Dei and what you and I would say are sort of natural law ethics.
Hmm.
Lutherans and Catholics have found a brilliant and effective way to work together. I
Right.
would argue that there wouldn't even be the kind of magisterial pro-life movement we have in this country without countless numbers, and I do mean countless numbers, of Lutherans and Catholics working together. And yet we have a president in Joe Biden who spent the early part, of his public policy career completely in sync with his own church, but
Hmm.
then gradually through the years became what he is now, which is, an abortion absolutist. In other words, there are no exceptions for this president on the question of the sanctity of life. And so, for all of the unity language, it's not really very unifying to be that much out of step and fully in opposition to your own religious and theological tradition. The Catholic Church's statement on the sanctity of life makes a remarkable distinction about public officials who actually take a proactive view in the destruction of the innocent preborn. And that is the heart of this matter, Greg. And the I think one of the great things about your vocation and the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, because at the end of the day, and there does come a sort of floor, doesn't there?
Right.
If you are the president or the secretary of HHS, or you're a former member of the House or a democratically elected official in the state of California, and you willfully, eagerly work toward the destruction of innocent people, I mean, it seems to me that that ought to be the front page of every paper and the lead of every news broadcast.
Well, and
And
it,
yet we hear very
yeah,
little about it.
and it goes to, like I said, some of the things that he was doing too. When you talk about the abortion industry, and that's one of the things that I'm just so tired of the euphemisms, because the abortion industry is making money by destroying
Yeah,
human life. That's what they
it's big
do.
business.
And
It's
this
very
guy,
big business.
yeah, and this guy sued that. What was the guy's name? Daniel, I think it was Delyden, the guy that went undercover and found that they were selling baby parts. Well, and, you would think that in a sane world we would say, "Wow, they're doing that. Well, this is terrible." No, this guy sued Daniel. This guy actually went after Daniel to destroy him because he did something nefarious. And I was just thinking, that's the kind of stuff that it seems like the moral the church is the moral voice of the culture, and government has no moral voice. Government is only a power voice. And eventually, if it feels like it can do something to you and it can get away with it and it can bless itself, it'll do it. And the church pushes back on that and says, but you can't do that, because we're human beings, or you cannot do that. And so, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the abortion movement we're talking about today, whether it's all these different movements, there's a moral component to them. And that's where the church exercises its greatest responsibility. And so again, to me, when you started talking about him being the Catholic president, I thought, just like they said he was going to be the moderate president or the unifying president, it's cover. There's a certain sense where once they say he's a Catholic guy, then it's kind of like cover. If you're Catholic, you can't speak against him. He brought Cesar Chavez's bust into the White House, for instance. And Cesar Chavez, who's a great leader among the with the immigrant workers in America kind of movement, he hated illegal immigration. He thought it was terrible for his workers. And yet Biden brings his bust in and basically advocates policies that Cesar Chavez would have hated. And again, I just think people got to see past this cover and start just judging people by the policy, judging people by the, the platform. That's the kind of stuff we've been trying to say, because this is really serious stuff. This life issue, talk about now how if this guy gets in charge, it's not just him running the AG of California and coming after some people. He's now got the whole weight of HHS, the whole weight of the federal government behind him. What could that mean for us?
Well, personnel is policy in Washington, D.C. There were rightfully a lot of our fellow Christians, in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump, trying to discern the issues of character and ethics, and rightfully so. Those are things that Christians are commanded to wrestle with in the public square. And I believe similarly that it's perfectly fine to raise moral and ethics questions with regard to the president and with regard to the people who are his top advisors. Right. There are several offices at the Department of Health and Human Services, far beyond Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Obamacare, etc., which also, Greg, have an enormous, a wellspring into pro-life and religious liberty policy. One of those offices is very little known. It's the Department of Civil Rights within HHS. And historically, since the creation of the department, this has been a font of policy making, within the department. And the former head of that office did something absolutely extraordinary. He said under Title 10 that if you are a non-for-profit, right, who performs abortions or promotes abortions, and you receive federal funding, that you should not be allowed to, because indirectly it's a way of taxpayers, indirectly funding what you do.
Right.
And this was a remarkable contribution of the HHS under former Secretary Azar. This is something I know that the Missouri Synod, the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, Focus on the Family, many of our allies absolutely cheered. National Right to Life, Susan B. Anthony. It was a terrific policy. The Supreme Court announced this week that they are going to review that policy. And I think what is possible is that because the Supreme Court has decided to review that policy, it may in fact spur the Biden pro-abortion administration just to get rid of it. They may try unilaterally to essentially erase that policy and make a case to the Supreme Court that, the policy no longer exists. We're going back to the pro-abortion policy before President Trump and Vice President Pence. And therefore, the administration would say to the Supreme Court, you simply don't have to consider this case any longer, because There's no such policy.
Yeah, we
And
wiped it
Greg,
out.
I think that that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
Well, and like you said too, because people say, well, but that's because you're pro-life. Well, first of all, there are 20 million pro-life Democrats, just so that we, get the facts out there. The second thing is what we're talking about is keeping the money out of it. So, the first thing that we Christians say is that if you're going to do this thing, which we think is heinous, then we shouldn't pay for it, and it shouldn't. There should be no taxpayer money that creates the business of abortion. And that's what George Bush said. Remember back in the day when he talked about stem cells and stuff like that? He said, I don't want to create a business model that means the more abortions means more stem cells. He didn't want that pressure to start to create an anti-life business model. And so it just seems to me that even if you're pro-choice, you would say, yeah, that's my responsibility. And you wouldn't want this kind of government money in, government money out. It keeps funding our policies, it keeps funding our elections. No, we don't want money that's built on this business involved in that. And yet that's some of the biggest money in Washington, D.C. And here you have them saying, and we're going to go back to that, and we don't have any problem with our conscience on this.
Two statistics, if I may. Since 1973, when the Supreme Court imposed Roe against Wade on all 50 states, we have had in America probably about 65 million abortions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is really a shocking statistic. It's equally shocking in the opinion of a lot of us in the pro-life community that Planned Parenthood, which has a business model, they are the chieftains of Abortion Inc. in the United States, that they receive $500 billion in federal funding. I mean, this is unjustifiable. It's unbelievable. And yet year after year, they find a way. Again, going back to where we started, the mother's milk of politics, follow the money.
That's right.
They find a way, to play upon the so-called heartstrings of those who share their pro-abortion views in the House and in the Senate. It's immoral. And even at basic, it's deeply unethical.
And that money, by the way, in our educational discussions, that money owns the teachers' unions because it flows over that way. A lot of that agenda is over there. A lot of public school teachers are telling us about that. Get Out Now, that book written by 2 educators in California, talks about this kind of stuff. And for us, we're just saying, again, if the federal government's going to do something, their job is to be limited. Their job is to actually do things that we all need done. That's their job. The states are where we actually start to figure out what we need uniquely in our own neighborhoods and our own states. And here these guys are doing these federal policies that dictate to all of us a particular moral view. And in this case, it actually is a moral view that is not shared by most people. Most people believe abortion, even if it should be legal, should be very regulated. And remember, the old phrase was legal but rare. And that was what the Democrats used to say. And again, now we're talking about people that are saying all the way past the 9th month, even if the baby's born alive. And of course, we're selling baby parts and things like that. You're starting to say, folks, we've got to push back on this as a country, because we're a country that values life. We value human life basically for all people. So again, I think you were talking about the implications of the culture. I just think that if a culture becomes this indifferent to life, I think that's what scares me more than anything else. It's one thing about the policy, and it's going to push back on the church. I think the church has to raise its moral voice to this. And if you're individuals, you've got to make your decision, but you got to let your representatives know what you think about this. But what kind of culture are we going to be in if we are this indifferent to life? If like you said, the nuns can be sued, the pro-life clinics can be knuckled under, and you wind up paying for some of these services even though you're morally against them. Where does that leave us?
I have to say, I think we saw 2 really astonishing examples of this just in the last few years, quite apart from here in Washington. One of them was in New York State, where Governor Cuomo signed a bill on giving a green light to partial birth abortion. And beyond that, he actually celebrated.
They clapped.
Exactly. They lit up the skyline of Manhattan, to celebrate the further destruction of innocent human life, with the full assent of the cultural and political and legal elites in the so-called Empire State. Similarly, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam, many people may not know, is actually a pediatrician, and he is a pediatrician who specializes in the most kind of intricate surgery on children. And he did an interview here in Washington, not only favoring partial birth abortion, but in the course of the interview, offered his instruction about what should happen if the baby, at the 9-month mark is born, how they should, ignore the child and to essentially allow the baby to die a natural death. So we know as Christians that it's about grace and mercy. Absolutely, grace is real. It's the most real thing in our lives. We also know that the law is real. That vengeance is not ours. And we also know that God is not mocked. And if governors and presidents and heads of HHS actively and willfully participate in this kind of frontal assault on the dignity and sanctity of human life, we have to trust that ours is a just God, and that in the public square, the righteous voice is to stand up for the innocent preborn who cannot speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I not only concur with you on that, sometimes I think our church is being lulled into this notion, and my agency deals with this too, that it's religious liberty, let us be who we are. And that's true, but there are some issues where we actually have to voice what we know to be true for all people. And there aren't too many moral, thus saith the Lord's, that are that clear cut in our culture as a whole. The sanctity of life is one of them. And it, like you were talking about, it goes to what kind of people we are, and the preborn, as well as the end of life issues. And I can see a hardening, this kind of utilitarian view of life, like it's only worth something to me if it's worth something to me. Well, you're going to find out what human beings can do to each other when they start to treat each other with that utilitarian, pragmatic view, rather than with the sacred view that you were created in the image of God, that you have personal rights that come from and dignities that come from that. We could be in a radically different culture in less than a generation. In fact, in less than a decade, we could see that turning happen very quickly.
I'm very glad that you said that. Not only do I fully concur, but I'm actually praying regularly that President Biden and Vice President Harris would come to be advocates of the pro-life position. That they, by the gift of the Holy Spirit, I pray, would be able to actually review the implications of their present position. And to change their minds. One of the most wonderful gifts that any person could ever be given is the gift of reason and faith together. And there comes a moment where people of goodwill and people who have been given the gift of reason can see the horror and the destructive nature, of the pro-abortion industry. And so I really do pray that this administration, some would say miraculously, would come to see the beauty of the culture of life.
In the name of Jesus, we pray that for sure. And you just reminded me of something. I was with Cal Thomas one time. They were talking about things, and he was at an event we spoke at together. And you remember Bob Beckett, and he used to have those USA Today kind of debates in the back paper. Yeah. And Beckett was a big pro-abortion guy. He was a big pro-choice guy. And one day they came to talk to him. The Planned Parenthood because he was going to do a fundraiser. And he said, I can't do that anymore. And Thomas talked about how he came to faith and he suddenly saw that for what it was. And he just said, I can't be a part of that anymore. That's all we're saying. You know, when we think about folks, again, if you're listening to us, this is way more than policy. This is cherishing life. This is cherishing your neighbor. This is cherishing the person that you don't agree with. This is cherishing the person on the other side of the aisle. There's something that has to be there whether you like them or not first, and that has to be this sanctity of life notion, this idea that you have dignity because you're created by God. That's got to be there first if we're ever going to come back to some kind of moderation and unity and all these kinds of things. And what Tim and I have been talking about today is actually an affront to that. And it's actually using that as cover. And so we've got to uncover that. We've got to pray about this. We've got to get involved in this and pray too that maybe this thing is derailed and maybe a more moderate voice is brought to bear, because it's a very, very powerful agency and it can affect all kinds of things for the church, for the school, and for your individual lives. So Tim, thanks so much for being here with me today and kind of keeping us abreast of this as you and I do this together. We're just trying to make sure our church is prepared. So thanks again for being on Liberty Alert.
It's such a pleasure and honor, and I'm so honored to be a member of a synod which is categorically pro-life. It's really a joy. And thank you so much, Greg.
It's great to have been here with you again. And again, I'll see you later this week. We've got some work to do this week too. But God bless you all. And again, remember, God is in control, two kingdoms. He's even in control of things that are going on here. But again, we're called to be useful in his hands. We're called to be his moral voice in the culture, even as we're his gospel invitation voice in the culture as well. So be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and until we see Jesus Christ face to face, till next time, God richly bless you. Have a great week.